is it paradoxical to believe that our behaviour is predetermined while also that we have personal responsibility, as Massimo was talking about? So perhaps I can go to you first, because you were making a sort of argument for both, weren't you? You were saying,
in a sense,
it sort of depends on, again, how we're defining terms. So if you take this first.
Yeah, so as you just heard, we have specific areas of our brain that are in fact in charge of decision making, or at least they're involved heavily in decision making. In a sense, our brains are sophisticated decision making machines. Biological machines for sure, complex for sure, but they are nevertheless, that's what they're for. That's a big part of what they do. So that is the part of the web of cause and effect that I was mentioning a minute ago that is internal to us. And because my particular machinery is different from yours or from yours and so on and so forth, then in a very important sense, those are my choices and not those of somebody else. At the same time, I worry a little bit when we talk about responsibility as opposed to, let's say, ownership, right? So I have no problem owning my own decisions, meaning that I can say those are my decisions. When talking about responsibility, and obviously we're referring to moral responsibility, then the issue gets a little bit more complicated. For one thing, I think that moral responsibility is not a particularly useful construct because it's often used to just blame people and punish people and do all sorts of things that are not very constructive. What we should be doing when people make mistakes, when people make the wrong decision, is to try to fix what was wrong with that decision and to try, if possible, even to fix the machinery that made that decision. In other words, to rehabilitate people, as opposed to just put them away in jail for 30 years and lock the thing and throw the key out. So it's more constructive, I think, to not think in terms of moral responsibility as much as in terms of flawed or non-flawed decision-making, more or less flawed decision-making. I don't want to push the analogy too much, but if you have a complex machine that makes decisions of a certain kind, let's say a computer, you don't really blame the computer morally when it makes a mistake. You try to fix it. You open it up and you figure out, okay, what is it exactly that's going on? Now, we are a lot more complicated than computers, but we're still biological machines. So when we make decisions, you mentioned a minute ago, for instance, if there are brain anomalies, for instance, or genetic anomalies that lead certain people to behave in ways that are clearly out of the norm, well, that means we just have identified a particular cause and we can either fix that cause or take that cause into account when we make decisions about what to do or what not to do.
Can I bring Sarah in on, you were mentioning that there are dedicated areas of the brain that guide us. Could you just fill in a little more about how that operates in your research?
So there is this dynamic relationship between sort of limbic circuitry and emotional-led architecture in the brain. And there are inhibitory regions from the prefrontal cortex which help control those impulses and those inhibitions. And people may differ in those fundamental drives. Bursts of anger may be higher in some people, but there is also these regulatory areas which people can exercise control. And in the vast majority of cases, then that's why people need to be accountable for their actions. And I do agree with what you say about the role of society. And of course, there are exceptions like psychosis, but I disagree with your pinpointing genetics.
Okay.
Because
Sure.
genetics, I mean, there's something like Huntington's disease, which we know can be derived from a single genetic abnormality. But the vast majority of cases, if it was a simple mapping of genetics to behavior, we would have cured many diseases.
Oh, yeah.
And
I completely agree.
Yeah.
No, I did not mean to imply that there is any simple mapping between genetics and behaviors. There absolutely isn't. So, except for those very occasional cases that you're talking about. But that said, our genetic machinery, meaning our full genetic complement, obviously does account for a lot of the causal web of what it means to be you or me or somebody else.
Yeah.
We develop, for instance, in a certain way from growing up, from when we're born on, because in part of that genetic machinery and how it interacts with the environment in complex ways. All I wanted to say was that there are causes, but that doesn't mean that those causes are easy to pinpoint or it's even worth trying to pinpoint them.
Yeah.
Can I bring in Galen on this question of genetics to just explain again why this is so fundamental?
For me, it's just a detail. It's my argument just goes as before. I mean, it doesn't matter how you came to be, how you are, but it's not ultimately up to you how you came to be. But I of course know that we need a fairly robust notion of personal responsibility to run a society.
Right.
As obvious, as a pragmatic. But the question is to both of you really is whether you think that punishment, I mean, you tried to sideline it, but you can't sideline it that much. Whether you think that punishment, as it were, handed down by a court is ever truly just or fair, or is it just pragmatically required? Or
it's a good question.
I think that's a brilliant. I want that you've brilliantly signalled us into the next area.
Oh.
Just before we do that, though, I wanted to ask you one question. We're going to retain that excellent question.
Okay.
Just one question about Sartre, because you mentioned Sartre.
Yes.
And I mean, I guess as you were saying, he has that notion that you make a pact with your future self, and that's fundamental to being human, is to say, I will. And then you can make this decision. I mean, how does our discussion relate to this sort of Sartrean idea?
Yeah, well, the Sartre is good at stories, and his story is set in the Second World War, and the question is, should I stay behind to care for my very sick mother, or should I go off and join the resistance? And his point was really, he says you're condemned to freedom. That is, you're not free not to choose. That's the sense in which you're condemned to freedom. You have to choose. That's all I had in mind there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pose your question then. I think we'll do. Should we do that? So the next area.
I sympathise very much with what Massimo said at the beginning about you saying I don't think this notion of ultimate moral responsibility is very valuable. But I mean, it does look anyone who believes in any story about heaven and hell is committed to something like that.
Sure.
And that's why that is just out.
Yeah,
that is. I mean,
I agree. So you asked, under what circumstances punishment is a good idea. I don't think in any circumstances it is a good idea.
Yes,
what
but it's tremendously counterintuitive. What happens now? I bet somebody's already thought of it. Someone says, "What about Hitler?"
Right, of course. And okay, so since you brought Hitler up,
with this question of punishment, do we have to prove scientifically that the person has a gene, for example, that accounts for the crime?
I think it's irrelevant.
Or are you saying the whole structure?
The whole structure.
Yeah, so suppose one guy is brought up in a broken home and poverty and misery and all that. The other person went to Eton and had every possible advantage, and they both finish up doing the same crime. Well, of course we think that the guy who went to Eton should get a more punishment, but is that ultimately justifiable?
Right. Yeah.
Whatever happened to him made him the kind of person who's doing this.
Right. I don't think it is. So let's go back to Hitler for a minute. I know that especially in philosophical discussions, there is now in recent years, somebody has proposed that we have a new informal fallacy, the reductio ad Hitlerium. Whatever you bring up Hitler, that's it. That's the end of the discussion. But in fact, I think it's a good point.
It's the end.
No.
When you talk about Hitler.
I think it's a good point. So my story about Hitler is the following. There is a colleague of mine, Owen Flanagan, who is a practicing Buddhist and a philosopher. And early on in his practice, he had the fortune to meet the Dalai Lama. And he was really bothered, Owen was really bothered by the Buddhist notion that you should never be angry because anger is a destructive emotion, which I share as I tend to be also a Stoic practitioner, and the Stoics have the same idea. But Owen was like, what do you mean I shouldn't be angry? And so his example was, if I had the classic time machine, shouldn't I go back in time and kill Hitler before he does what he's going to do? And shouldn't I do it because I'm angry at what he was going to do? And the Dalai Lama's response was perfect, in my opinion. He said, yes, you should absolutely go back and kill Hitler. In fact, you should do it with some fanfare if possible. You should make a big deal out of it. Invite people to the party because it's a big deal. But no, you should not be angry because Hitler is just one more point in the cosmic sequence, in the cosmic web of cause and effect. He did not ask to be there. He was not ultimately responsible for being there. You should treat him as a doctor treats a tumor. You don't get angry with tumors, you just excite them. Okay? And if it's a big tumor, you make a big deal out of it. You give a party afterwards. But other than that, so that's the way I would approach things. Now, if you don't excite the tumor, because you don't want to take it completely out, then you try to reform the tumor. You try to bring it back to some kind of normal. So should we put away people if they're dangerous, actively dangerous to others? Yes, I think we should. But what we should do during that period is try to reform them if possible at all. That should not be a punishment, because the concept of punishment makes no sense to me.
And I just want to ask you one question on that. I know Galen wants to come in. Are you saying then that, so in this sequence of cause and effect, is there no original cause in your kind of philosophical?
No.
No, so there's no first mover in this. There's no originating, because the cause and effect is a kind of cause and effect without an original cause.
The quantum similarity, the quantum singularity at the Big Bang, possibly. But the issue is, doesn't matter, right? Whatever was at the beginning, the first mover of whatever kind, the fact is we find ourselves in a mechanical universe that works in a certain way, and we should act accordingly, not by going after fantasies like hell and heaven and stuff like that. By the way, we always talk about punishment, but reward is the same thing. We shouldn't be going around rewarding people either.
No rewards. Okay, Galen.
I think leave it if you want to get onto the...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.